there is at least some part of the discourse or the narrative out there that says, oh, you're a Christian entrepreneur. That means you're not like a real entrepreneur. Like you don't do it really well and you don't do it of excellent quality. And I think that's what's changing.
Hello, and welcome to Working with me, Dan Doriani, hosting a podcast where we explore faith, work, culture, and the way believers can make a difference in their corner of the world. Well, welcome to today's podcast. My guest today is Brett Smith. He is a professor. He teaches at Miami University of Ohio, the really awesome Miami University. Miami is one of the top schools for entrepreneurship, and Brett is one of the leaders in that field. He's been digging into it hard for the last less than a decade, has always had some interest in that area, and he has an institute called LIFE, L-I-F-E. It's leading the integration of faith and entrepreneurship. What your goal is, if I understand it correctly, Brett, and you're always free to reintroduce yourself, is to create a body of research that enables the 80% of the world that has a faith that they want to show in their life, in business, and especially in entrepreneurship. And a lot of people end up separating their life of faith from their life at work. And it has all kinds of effects. You've interviewed people about that. You've researched that for years. Did I get the most basic facts right about you?
It's absolutely perfect, and I'm honored to be here. So first off, thank you for the opportunity. And look, if I can ever be in the same likes as Alan Barnhart and Tom Nelson, previous podcasters, then we're in great company. So humbled to be here.
I'm very glad to have you here. And it's such an important topic because I'll let you say it. Entrepreneurs are vital to the lifeblood of any economy. And as your research shows, most entrepreneurs have a faith and they don't always know how to integrate the two. Let me just let you have an opportunity to give a sort of a burst about what you do and why you do it.
So at one level, it's an extension of the faith and work conversation, with the distinction being that maybe entrepreneurship is an extreme form of work. There are lots of extreme forms of work: investment banking, being a pastor. These are extreme forms of work. So this is not unique in that sense, but it is different in this sense. There tends to be a lot more agency. So if I'm a mid-level manager at a corporation, I may not have the same agency that I have within my own entrepreneurial venture about how we do certain things or the values that we might bring into play. So at one level, it's that. I think the other thing that's maybe important is I think we're at a unique cultural moment where faith and entrepreneurship actually have this opportunity to bring together two substantial forces. Entrepreneurship, which today is probably as significant as any point in history, in that if we want to do anything in business, of course, we turn to entrepreneurship, but also in social problems, we're going to solve it entrepreneurially. So you have that, and now you combine it with the most significant force in all of human history, in faith, and you bring these two things together. There's a unique moment in time that's happening right now that seems to be building on the past, but also is really at a pivotal sort of transformative point in the present.
That's a great summary. And if I can just make it clear, you and I share a Christian faith.
Correct.
But you are not only interested in working with Christians. You don't just research how Christians practice their faith. You're going to research other nations, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, etc., and see what you can learn as a scholar about the way faith shapes our work. As a Christian, you're maybe a little bit more interested living in America. You're a little bit more interested in the way Christian faith shapes our work. Is that a fair or accurate representation?
Sure. I think the answer is yes and no, right? So the reality is, let's hope that whatever it is that we have some expertise about, right? So often the conversation will go about something like women's entrepreneurship. Well, who should study that? And people are like, well, the women can't study it. They're too biased. The men can't study it because they don't know anything about it. So we're running out of people to study it. And I think some of that holds true here. Much of the work we do does come from a Christian perspective, because that also happens to be the perspective that I most know and understand. When we do studies across multiple faiths, we will then bring in experts I have a great friend who lives in Germany, Ali Gumase, who writes about Islamic entrepreneurship. So if we're going to do a study together, we're going to bring his expertise with my expertise together and then start to understand commonalities and differences.
Yeah. I know I send you a list of questions to talk about, but that prompts me to come back to introduce earlier than anticipated something you have. You use words like emancipation, passion, and identity, being strong in entrepreneurs. And I will tell you, one of the great blessings of my life is that I've known a lot of entrepreneurs, and including a member of my own family who's an entrepreneur. And it just resonated as true, accurate, and helpful, because entrepreneurs are often people who've been in a setting. They have they're not averse to risk, and they have confidence. They have confidence in their agency, but they also want to get free from, it could be a boss who's cruel or foolish, but it could also be just to get away from the strictures that are imposed on anybody who's in the middle of an organization and would like to do things to be more just, more loving, more for the common good, or even to have greater profits. And they simply find they can't do so because they propose, and there are 5 levels of approval above them in a big corporation, or 2 or 3, even a smaller one. And of course, that often has to do with their identity. So that just seemed like one of the themes you have that popped out at me. Talk to me and us about emancipation, identity, and we'll get to passion maybe next.
For sure.
Okay.
So let me start with the identity piece. So a lot of what we do at the Center for Life is we try and do what we hope is academically rigorous and practically relevant research. Mm-hmm. If it's not practically relevant, we shouldn't be doing it. If it's not academically rigorous, then no one should read it, right? It shouldn't, It shouldn't matter. And so what we're trying to do is actually build on this growing movement of people that are integrating their faith into their entrepreneurial venture. It's awesome that it's going on. And yet, at many conferences, someone will stand up and say, hey, this is my story. And I say, I love your story, but your story is only one story. So how do we begin to aggregate some of these stories so that we can start to see trend lines? And how can we start to see what's working? And how can we be honest enough to say, and where are some of our blind spots? And so at a high level, that's what we're trying to do with academic research and bring it into practical relevance. And so people will say, great, you wrote an academic study, only 10 people are going to read it. I said, oh, don't flatter me, it'll only be 5. But there's 2 things that matter. One is, do you know how many those 5 people teach? And the second thing is, anytime there's an area that we don't really understand, I drink cherry tart juice at night and it helps me sleep better. People don't believe it until someone says, there's a study that says.
Yes.
Well, in a sense, that's what we're trying to do.
By the way, there is
here.
a study that says that.
Right. We're trying to do that. So at one level, what we're trying to do is do studies that say, how does faith and entrepreneurship work? What are the processes? What are the outcomes? What are the influences? One of the very first things that ever comes to mind is identity. And so if I could just talk about one study for a moment, the study started this way. We were talking to a bunch of entrepreneurs who go through what we all affectionately know as the low lows and high highs. And unfortunately, that means not only their venture, their business goes through lows and their business goes through highs, but so too does their identity. Their identity tends to follow a very similar path to the success and failure of their business. And so our question was effectively—
Can I interrupt? You would say that that's true more of an entrepreneur than, let's say, a middle manager or somebody's in the corporate machine. Not that everybody's identity is somewhat tied to their work, but you would say this is more true of entrepreneurs.
I think it is as true of entrepreneurs as almost anybody else.
Okay.
Could you tie in musicians or professional athletes or investment bank? Maybe. Yeah. But this is, most people will say entrepreneurship is a crucible, for better or for worse. Like, you're going to find out what people are made of in this crucible. And so I think that's part of what you get here. So when entrepreneurs go through these lows and highs, our question was, well, what difference does it matter if they have faith? We're looking from a Christian perspective. And so the question was, what difference does faith make? What we find is this. We find that these entrepreneurs have a second identity, what we term a relational identity with God, which many Christians would pretty quickly be able to understand as 3 parts. There is a father-child, parent-child relationship to it. It is received rather than achieved. And it is far more permanent than this constantly fluctuating entrepreneurial identity. So at a macro level, here's what we find. We find that a relational identity with God acts as a counterbalance to their entrepreneurial identity. In times of lows, their relational identity with God actually affirms them out of their lows. And in times of highs, it actually humbles them out of their highs and ends up with a much more stable sort of identity.
Yeah. So in your high, you're still saying, listen, so much of what I have is received, and I am still not the master of the universe, but a child of God. So thank you, Lord, for the gifts I have and for the favor you've shown. I have not now proven myself to the world at the high point and low point. I don't know if we have to elaborate on it, but certainly if I am a person of worth, if and only if I have a success and give a good return of investment to the people who gave their capital to me, then of course failure is going to be devastating.
That's right. And ironically, we were not surprised in the lows, like to your point, everyone sort of gets them. But we were surprised in the highs. And entrepreneurs said to us over and over again that the highs in my entrepreneurial business were actually the most dangerous time for my identity, because I started to internalize just maybe how great I was rather than this was a gift that I had received. This was an opportunity that was granted to me. And so they were just as concerned about the highs as they were concerned about the lows in terms of what that does and how out of whack their identity might become.
Yeah. And I'll say, I can see that. I will tell you that it does affect other folks, people who win a sports championship perhaps, or win an Academy Award. I know that when I first started to speak, hit the speakers circuit, if I may call it that, I noticed that when I got back after being the speaker, I was extremely likely to want more of the kinds of attention from my wife and my kids that are unhealthy. Like, I just came back. I'm the conquering hero, right? And it only happened really to me one time. And I had a mentor, and I said, hey, I noticed that I got back and I was pretty, I was self-absorbed a little bit. And then he sat me down and said, listen, the most dangerous time for someone in ministry is right after they spoke at a conference. So it correlates. And in a certain way, there are comparisons between entrepreneurs and, honestly, professors, politicians, athletes, entertainers, to some degree, pastors, according to some studies I've seen.
No, and I think you're right, Dan. I think we've seen two things. One on the lows, the comparison is almost always to some expected standard. I want to achieve X amount. I want to raise X amount of capital. In the highs, it's almost always compared to themselves or to others. So it's almost always like, I was like this before, and now I'm worried I may not be able to get on the main stage again. What if I have to be the speaker who's put in the side room, right? And so it's this comparison to self, what they've done in the past or in the future, and it's this comparison to others. So an entrepreneur would say to us, hey, yeah, I've had a couple of really successful exits, but I might not like that entrepreneur who's, sold their company for over $1 billion.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, by the way, and just for clarity, when I say I've been in the speaker circuit, I've been in the first auxiliary room more often than I've been on the main stage.
You'd look great in the green room, I'm sure.
just trying to be honest here. So you do research, you're a hardcore researcher. For those of us who are in academia, you understand that in certain fields, what you want to do is publish books. In other fields, you publish articles. And you're in one of the fields where you publish articles. And I have to say, it's hardcore research. It's easy to see right away. We'll put some links to some of your articles for the sake of entrepreneurs in our show notes. But you kind of have fun with some of your titles, even though they're very academic, even though you proclaimed only 5 people read them. So here's my favorite. Trying to serve 2 masters is easy compared to 3. And then, identity multiplicity work by Christian impact investors. Identity multiplicity work. What on earth is identity multiplicity work? How on earth, you can't serve God and mammon. We get that. We serve the Lord. We don't serve the dollar. We need to make a profit, but we don't live to make a profit. But you say it's not 2 masters. I mean, obviously you're not correcting Jesus, but you're saying that an entrepreneur can have 3 masters?
So in this case, what we're really looking at is Christian impact investors.
Yes.
And what we're trying to understand is how do impact investors manage their multiple identities or the multiple expectations is a way to think about it.
And their multiple identities are Christian, investor, and
social impact, right? So I'm trying to drive some sort of social impact. I'm trying to generate some sort of financial return, and I'm trying to do it congruent with or even trying to extend faith or the faith impact.
So the common good is what we mean by that.
100%.
Right. We're not moving anything in our trucks.
Nope.
We're moving good things in our trucks.
And I think a lot of people will say, great, well, we just want all of those to be high. We want it to be high financial return and high social impact and high faith impact. Great. That's not hard. But there are very, very few opportunities that sort of maximize all three of those. Yeah. And so what tends to happen is as investors are looking at opportunities, they have to deal in trade-offs. They have to say, well, what if it's a higher financial return, but a lower social return? Or what if it's a higher faith return, but I'm not sure what the financial return is going to look like. So what we see is entrepreneurs have to or investors have to deal with these multiple sorts of expectations occurring all simultaneously. What one of our investors said, nobody likes to sit at the bar and talk about the loan that they gave for 10 years to an impoverished region in Africa, and they hope to break even. Mm-hmm. They want to talk about the 20x return they got and all the people they fed on the other side of the world, but that's not the way most of these opportunities work. And so what we're looking at is how do investors, and by the way, it need not be investors, but how do individuals manage these different expectations? And what we find is they end up having to surrender at least partially one of these identities, one of these sets of expectations. For many of the Christian entrepreneurs, they would say they would prioritize their faith-based identity, but it also means they're now trading off on these other things and giving up at least partial or some of that. And then I would say our most candid investors would say, yes, we are open to surrender, but we're still on the S of surrender. Like, this is hard work. This is a challenge.
We're still on the S of surrender. I like that. In other words, we're only making it about 1/8 or 1/10 of the way through. We're still working on it. So I've had other entrepreneurs on this podcast, and you're reminding me that one of them, who's very successful financially, does occasionally invest in things that he knows will break even at best. I mean, he told me in detail about one extraordinarily high social impact. He said we could lose every last dollar. He wasn't the only investor. There were 20 people. We could lose every last dollar we're putting into this, and we're ready to do that. And then they ended up making a lot of money because of certain market forces. They ended up producing something that was desperately needed in our nation. It had to do with the COVID crisis, and they ended up nailing one aspect of what needed to be done. And they ended up making a lot of money, and they decided to give it all away because they didn't want to profit. And they were all people that had gone into it knowing they all broke even, with one exception, and that was somebody whose business had been ruined by COVID and was in really serious debt. And everybody said, yeah, you go ahead and take your profits. May you be richly blessed, and this will help you work your way out of it and survive what happened. So, but of course, that would be probably more mature investors and more mature entrepreneurs. So my family member who's an entrepreneur has not been at it long. He is young, and he needs to have a positive return right now.
Yeah, I think yes and no. So I think one of the questions that happens is when we begin to integrate faith and work, or in this case, faith and entrepreneurship, the question is how. Right? There's lots of different ways we could integrate that. Do we just integrate the values? We are good people within business. We're not going to cheat our supplier.
Right. But we may do almost anything.
For sure.
As long as we're moral about it.
For sure. And or do we go all the way? There's a whole movement called Business's Mission, or BAM, right, which is all about, we actually want to see some sort of demonstrated apologetic, or we want to see some sort of missional evangelizing going on within that business. Now, neither of those are right or wrong. That's just the broad range at which different people can choose to integrate along this continuum. And so, a lot of times people are like, oh, this is an age issue. This is a stage of business issue. I would say this is a heart issue.
Okay.
And different people are called to different places along that continuum. Yes, sometimes that's over time, and sometimes that's immediately, at 22 years old.
Yeah. I know people who started businesses at 22, and their goal was just to demonstrate they could start a business. And then they started another one. And then when they're 37, they go, oh, now I've demonstrated, I've started 5 businesses, and honestly couldn't care less if the one I started when I was 21 in college failed, right? But when you're 40 and you have 3 kids, then it's a different matter. I'm pushing back a little bit and saying I agree with your point, but there are phases.
I think that's right.
There are phases when you have to be more sensitive to profitability, and there are phases we can afford to be less. But it's not a simple direct line. You're saying it's not a simple direct line. Once you made your money, you take risks.
Yeah, and look, I think one of the things we know is it's easier as we make more money to feel like we need more money, right?
Yeah,
that's
sure.
just that's our culture. I think you look to somebody like Alan Barnhart, and Alan said, hey, we're going to set a limit on our consumption. We're going to set a limit on our lifestyle. So no matter how well the business does, we're going to set a limit. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Because it's easy to keep when I get to that next hurdle or the next hurdle or the next hurdle, then we'll start to be more charitable. Then we'll start to integrate our faith more. I think the reality is it's possible at anywhere along the way. And how you do that may look very different from not only one stage to the next, but one person to the next.
And I might have even talked to Alan Barnhart about this, but perhaps the single most amazing quotation I ever got when talking about faith and work was a man who came up to me, and I'm going to say he was 42, 43 years old. And he said to me, Dan, I make twice as much money as I ever dreamed possible, and I find that it still isn't enough. And he was at a conference for Christians. So it's not like he was a godless person. He was mystified at himself. That's the point. But so let's say we've hit that a little bit. Let's talk about another theme that I want to cover with you, and that is, one of your first articles asked the question about the effect of faith on expectations. And you said in this article, and I can't find the title right now, maybe you can find it, that faith is both positive, but also has a potential downside for investors. And if I understood the article correctly, the idea was that you can say, listen, God will come through for me. God will bail me out. I'm making this very simple. Your article is much more sophisticated. And a Christian who invests, or a Hindu or Muslim, but a Christian who invests can underestimate the risks because they think their faith in God is going to make it work. Did I understand your article correctly? What's the research?
I think that's right on.
What do you have to say to an entrepreneur who is in danger of truncating their analysis of the facts because they think God will come through for them?
I think it's right. So part of what we're trying to do at the Center for Life, part of what we're trying to do to encourage others is, first off, to say, you don't have to do like your real research and your faith research. Like those can be the same things. Those can be really high, excellent quality. In our world, that means they're published in what we call Financial Times Top 50 journals. So you can publish at the highest quality and bring your faith into doing that. Part of what that also means is that, so that's to the academic community. To the practitioner community, I've had people come to me and say, hey, will you do a study that says? I said, no, we don't do those studies. I said, we'll do a study and see what it says.
Infomercial.
And I think this is where we have to be honest with ourselves to say, look, what role does faith play? And sometimes that's really, really positive. And other times, at least from a financial perspective, it may create some other things we need to think about. It may open our eyes to blind spots. So in this study, the basic question was, if we give, in this case, entrepreneurs, the ability to look at an opportunity with the likelihood of failure, success, all these kinds of things, magnitude of outcome, how would they respond? When the information is unambiguous, faith makes almost no difference. Everyone essentially decides the same way. If it's really positive, they're all gonna do it. If it's really negative, none of them are gonna do it. Mm-hmm. The difference happens when the information is ambiguous. And here's what happens, at least based on our data of Christian entrepreneurs, is Christian entrepreneurs tend to fill in the gaps of ambiguous data with positive information. So they do allow their faith to play arguably an overly positive role in how they look at the opportunity. That doesn't mean that's bad. It may turn out that opportunity is very good, but it does mean that they're filling in some of the gaps of the analysis, the due diligence with their faith, and that may not be positive. And so I think this is just an example of, it's our job to sort of look at and say, hey, what's going on in the data? And then let's at least know that and recognize that. What it may mean is a Christian entrepreneur may need a set of eyes for someone in their due diligence. They may need to go a little further with it. That's not a bad thing. It just means we need to understand the role faith may play in evaluating opportunities.
Yeah. Somehow this reminds me of a basketball league I was in, and my team was below average, and we were up against the best team in the league, which had, something like 3 guys that had played NCAA Division I or Division II basketball, and we had nobody that played Division I or II basketball. And somebody said, "So Dan," I was a pastor of the church. It was a church team in a non-church league, and they said, "So Dan, are we going to win tonight?" I said, "We are not going to win tonight." And he said, "Where's your faith?" I said, "My faith is intact. I'm just looking at the facts. If we lose by 25 points, I will count it a success. If we lose 90-65, that will be a good outcome." Are you saying that Christians have an easy time when it's going to be 90-65? The problem is when it's going to be 80-77.
I think that's right. I think like you're able to recognize, hey, my faith is intact, and yet the outcome is pretty clear about what it's likely to be. It's when we get into that middle range where it's like, we're not sure. It's a bit more ambiguous. We're not sure what those numbers, it could go either way, that at least on our study, Christian entrepreneurs are bringing their faith in to allow them to tip into the positive.
And that's not surprising, because Christians are fundamentally people with a positive outlook.
Of course.
I mean, we know that this world is fallen and sinful, but the Lord's redeeming it, and all things will be renewed, and we know that God's on our side. So we're biased toward the positive, and I think we ought to be biased toward the positive.
Well, and let's be honest, some entrepreneurs would never start if they weren't. I have a good friend of mine who is tackling sex trafficking in India, a very complicated problem, and trying to do it through a business model. If he were only relying on the data of the likelihood of success, he would go do something else.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
His faith is so strong and so important, not just as a motivation, but also to understand what the possibilities might look like, that in fact it propels him to action.
Yeah, you use the word outcomes. I want to interrupt you, but you were on a good roll a little while ago. But the outcomes of entrepreneurial activity, and ordinarily we think about profitability and providing jobs, and doing those things that the Lord approves. I was naked, you clothed me. I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was in prison, you visited me, and that covers most of the economy. And then there are other aspects of the economy that are negative, we might say, like I won't go into it. It's easy to name it. But you're saying that a Christian may tackle something that has a very strong likelihood of no positive financial outcome with full knowledge, because they're so committed to the social good that can be achieved if all goes well. And they can enter that with their eyes wide open. The odds are against me. I probably won't achieve a great deal. But you know what? If I save 70 kids, even though I don't want to calculate how much it costs to save those 70 kids. I'm throwing financial calculations out the window. That's a legitimate activity. You just have to know what you're doing. Am I hearing you correctly?
I think that's right. I think there's a whole segment of work. So some people would lump it into nonprofit activity. Some of that's true, but I think increasingly people are taking more of an entrepreneurial approach. They're calling it things like social entrepreneurship. And they are trying to figure out, how do we use market mechanisms to still generate positive common good? And they may recognize that it may never be fully self-sufficient, but yet if I can generate 80% of the costs and have all of these positive social or faith-related outcomes, that it might be worth that risk, and I might be able to find other sort of sources of capital to be able to connect the dots.
All right, let me ask you a question that may be outside your expertise. But we all know that not-for-profits and for-profits operate in different ways. Why is it that you seem to be indicating that you see value in social entrepreneurship? Why is it wise for people like you and other believers who are experts to say, instead of doing this in a nonprofit manner, let's look for some level of profitability, even though we know that the return might be less? What's the advantage of going in the entrepreneurial or business model in cases like that?
I think if we look at kind of how this is played out, we tend to have a nonprofit model and a for-profit model, and those are really the only two models. Well, a for-profit model means that there's a market out there that we can actually generate profit from. A nonprofit model means there are funders who are willing to give us philanthropic capital.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't have that as a funding source, what a social entrepreneurial model allows you to do is begin to blend some of that. So now you have a whole rise of investors that are impact investors. I want to see some financial return, but I'm willing to trade off some to get outsized social impact or faith-related impact. And so it's actually the emergence of sort of a third sector. It's not to say nonprofit or for-profit is better or worse. It's to say it's actually a different model that borrows from both logics to have this sort of in-between space. Sometimes donors like it because they're like, I can give you money and you may not be coming back to me again the next month, the next year, the next whatever. It deals with something like donor fatigue. Sometimes the businesses like it because they're like, oh, okay, now there is actually a market-based mechanism to try and drive that. So I don't think it's a value judgment of it's better or worse than nonprofits or for-profits. I think it sits in a unique space that borrows some logics from both sides.
I feel like I'm going to one of your classrooms. You teach in the classroom. And just to remind everybody for a moment that you are a man who teaches at a university, and that's why you sound like a teacher. You also create information for public use. So let me go to this. Two questions that I want to move over to a little bit. You talk about mechanisms, and one of the mechanisms you describe is shadowing, where we talked earlier about multiple identities. And one, if I understand your articles correctly, one identity casts a shadow over another, not negatively, but positively. Casting a shadow usually means something negative, but casting a shadow to enable you to pursue related goals. So maybe the shadow is we've got a man who writes scripts, he's an entertainer, something like that. Maybe he's a comedian or she's a comedian. And the shadow is that this person's also a dad, and you don't want to create stuff that makes you cringe when your children find it when they're 9. That occurs to me as one possible. Or you're a citizen and you care about your nation, and you want to make sure that in some sense or other, you're saying that whatever I work on is going to have some positive impact on my nation as best I can tell. Is that what shadowing is? Is that part of it? I'm sure there's more to it.
Yeah. So Dan, I hate to say this, but you're understanding the academic literature so well. So either we've actually made it so that it's accessible, or your knowledge is so great that you've been able to break through these academic opaque articles. But in summary, that the shadowing idea is just this. Some investors, in this case we were looking at, say, I want to have a financial return, I want to have a social return, and I want to have a faith-related impact of some kind. Maybe that's number of people saved, number of baptisms, like fill in the blank on whatever they want to measure. And they are saying, for me to make an investment, I need some minimum amount of impact in each of those three areas. This is what we call distinguishing. I need to keep all of those separate, and I need to hit some minimum threshold. Shadowing usually happens, at least in our data, between the social impact and the faith-related impact. As an entrepreneur or as an investor would say to us, like, don't you think feeding hungry people is a faith-related impact? So they didn't see a need to measure both social and faith-related outcomes because they felt like those, one sort of shadowed the other, one sort of took the place of the other and covered it up. And so they were quite comfortable saying, as long as we have some financial viability and some social related impact, we're quite comfortable that getting people out of the sex trade is a kingdom impact. I don't need to now go measure did a certain number of people, get a Bible distributed to them.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good. So just to make it really clear, we talked before we started about this a little bit. So a Christian investor, let's say, who's not the entrepreneur now, but the investor, is going to say, look, I'll back your business because you are coming up with a model of giving jobs to women and children who have been trafficked. And we actually think we can make a profit from the shoes or the necklaces or whatever it is that you make using indigenous tools, and we can bring it, we can import it into America. I'm thinking about an actual entrepreneur I know. And we're Christians, and so our faith is going to shine, but we're not strictly doing it in order to have the opportunity to say, do you believe in Jesus? It's good enough to rescue these children from slavery, whatever form of slavery there may be. Now, on the other hand, this is what we talked about before we started. If I'm a Christian doing this, people are going to ask questions like, why are you doing this? I mean, don't you realize how difficult this is? Don't you know that people can become very angry about the loss of their slaves, which is a biblical theme, and come after you? Well, I'm doing it. Yes, I'm doing it because I care about you, but I'm doing it as a matter of love and obedience to my Lord Jesus. And so evangelism occurs, but the goal is not evangelism per se, but more like a holistic life.
I think that's fair. I think a lot of evangelism occurs, at least in this sector, indirectly rather than directly. So it occurs because someone says, hey, I don't understand why you're trying to tackle the problem of helping people get out of the sex trade. That's an impossible problem. You're never going to get there. You could be doing so many other things to make so much more money. And now that opens the conversation of the not what are you doing, but the why behind the work. What is the motivation for the work, and why are you doing that work? And I think that's where an awful lot of evangelism in and around this sector tends to occur. I think the other thing I would say, Dan, is I think sometimes work in this area at the intersection of faith and entrepreneurship gets lumped into very small sort of nonprofit organizations. That's not true. You see, the Hallow app is a wonderful example. It is a Catholic prayer and meditation app that has raised $150 million in traditional venture capital funding. So someone has now developed a prayer app that says venture capitalists are going to back this.
Yeah, right.
This has changed the paradigm for what's possible at this intersection. And I think that's what's going on. So others will say, hey, this isn't new. Like, people have been integrating faith and entrepreneurial, faith and venture as far back as you want to go. I said that's absolutely true. This is resurgent. And what we're seeing now is the size, the scale, the intensity, the magnitude is different. The number of people that are doing it, the amount of money that is pouring into it, the number of entrepreneurs and accelerators that are doing this work is fundamentally different. And that does feel like an inflection point.
Yeah, let me give an example that's pretty commonplace. A lot of people follow the media. Most likely the people who backed The Chosen, that series of programs about the life of Christ, which have high production values, good acting, the cinematography is solid. I'm not trying to take a stand on, take little liberties here and there to try to create interest in minor characters and so forth. I'm talking about the quality of the product from an artistic standpoint, and the quality of the writing, quality of acting, which then generated millions and millions of viewers. And those who invested in it probably made a lot of money. Now, they may have plowed it back into other ventures. That's their prerogative. And then, as more and more people were finding The Chosen, then the big media companies said, hey, we would like to acquire this. And then another big media company said, hey, why don't we do this again? And so at this moment that we're having this conversation, The House of David was just released. And I wanted to watch a couple episodes because it's high production values. Whether you like every last thing that you see in terms of what did David actually look like and what did he behave like, what were his brothers like, and so forth, it quotes the Bible directly a lot, and it's got good actors. And there's a really good chance it's going to make money. And we are living in a day when both can happen. You can have social impact, faith impact, and profitability.
I think it's right. And I think what you're seeing, and not that people haven't known this before, but I think people are taking it more seriously today, is The first requirement of making a good table is that that it's a good table. So I think the excellence in the work. So I'm not trying to pick on any particular industry. Look at books, look at movies, look at businesses. There is at least some part of the discourse or the narrative out there that says, oh, you're a Christian entrepreneur. That means you're not like a real entrepreneur. Like you don't do it really well, and you don't do it of excellent quality. And I think that's what's
you're
changing.
Not willing to fire people if you don't, or lay people off if you don't, and you're just going to let it go down in flames so you can be viewed as a nice guy.
And I think what's changed is there is now an understanding that excellence is required, not optional, and that it is possible and not problematic to both make money and make a huge difference, both whether it's socially or from a faith-related perspective. Both are possible.
I'm looking at one of your other very intriguing titles, and then I want to get to a very practical question. Your other title really made me say, I'm going to read this first, is Does Religion Matter to Angels? Which, of course, does not mean angels like Gabriel. It means angel investors. It's a play on words, which, of course, economists would have picked up immediately. It took me 5 seconds. And then the subtitle is something like Religion and Investor Decision Making. That was in 2023. Have you covered everything you want to say from that article? You've been touching on that article somewhat, but what else do you want to add?
And this is actually to our connection, Andrew Clark. He was super gracious as we were. Look, we want to be academically rigorous, but we also want to be practically relevant. And so we went to Andrew and said, hey, could you help connect us to investors that would be willing to sort of participate in this study? The basic question is simple. If an entrepreneur is going out to raise capital, does religion help or does it hurt? Mm-hmm. Right? Does it help them raise money or does it hinder them from raising money? So that's the basic question. The answer, of course, is it depends. Right. But the it depends is actually rather interesting. So if you're raising capital from a secular investor, it generally hurts. So if the angel investing organization is secular, it's probably going to be a deterrent.
They're worried about the rigor of a Christian.
Of course,
somehow you're going to let your faith blind you, something like that.
The second part of it is, but if you're actually raising from an organization where faith matters, it actually helps. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it helps. It hurts when it's secular. It helps when it's sacred. Okay, great. Did we really need a study to say that? No. But here's what we did need a study to say. We did need a study to say, but if the investor themselves at the secular firm does have a faith, it actually moderates it. It solves the problem. And if the funder does raise money from a faith-based investor, it's not for the reason you think it is. They don't think you have a good business. They actually think you are trustworthy. So it has nothing to do about the business itself and much more to do about the evaluation of the character of the individual. And so it just helps us understand as we start to unpack, hey, increasingly there are more faith-based investors, there are more faith-based entrepreneurs. How are they going to raise capital and what's going to matter? Here we start to see, well, the faith of the individual investor matters, the faith of the organization matters, and what is actually being evaluated is not the attractiveness of the business. It's actually the trustworthiness of the entrepreneur.
Which makes sense. I mean, I'll say from my perspective, if somebody asks me to invest in something, I want to know, which people haven't asked me to invest in things. I want to know, are you hardworking? Or is this all going to blow up because you're a drug addict or an alcoholic or because, you're, I don't know, a terrible family man and it all blows up? I mean, character does help at some level. It seems to me.
100%.
Yeah. All right. Let me get real practical for a minute. Okay. 2 questions. We're almost to the end. Question number 1, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you have a 42-year-old Christian or 44-year-old Christian, and he has started his first, or she has started her first business 2 years ago, and they're coming to you for advice. They've made a few mistakes maybe, and they've had some successes as well. Professor Smith, tell me what I most need to know from your research. I'm a Christian, I'm a disciple, but honestly, I'm an entrepreneur first. I mean, I'm trained in this. I know how to get cargo from point A to point B. I know how to grow crops. I know how to, operate in the financial services field. Help me. I don't need technical knowledge. Tell me a few things that I most need to know. Here we are in the same room for 3 minutes. eating hors d'oeuvres together?
Well, I think at the intersection of faith and entrepreneurship, the first question is, what do you want to do, right? So the issue is really around, I said a hard issue. The issue is really around motivation. I get students who walk into my classroom and they think that if I'm going to integrate my faith into whatever work I'm going to do, I've got two options. I can go be an investment banker, make as much money as I can, and then give it all away to faith-based organizations,
At the age of 50 or something.
or I can move to the other side of the world and be a missionary. And I said, those are two awesome opportunities. Those are two of about a million choices.
Right.
And I think the entrepreneur is confronted with the same issue. So thinking about what you want to integrate into your venture, what that looks like, why that's important, how that's going to play out, not only for you, but also for your organization, takes a lot of intentionality. So are you going to pray before meetings? There's not a right or wrong answer to that, but it does matter a great deal to your employees about whether you do or not. It does matter who you hire. It does matter how you raise capital. So what I would say is make this decision about integration on the front end. It's much harder to make this decision later. We were studying an organization. The two founders were both professing Christians, but their organization, you wouldn't see it. Yes, they would have values like honesty, but great. Everyone has values like honesty. Most people think that's a good thing. At some point, 3 years into the organization's life, they decide, oh no, we're going out to the world about our faith. And they said something like, all of our success is because of God.
But it was a shock to the system.
The shock to the system. And some people where faith wasn't important said, well, I thought I kind of worked hard this past year.
Right.
And so it was this transmission of values that was net new. So all the way back to the advice. The advice would be to be really intentional, to be really upfront, and to be really transparent. So whatever you're going to do anywhere along that continuum, that's entirely up to you. Back to the beginning, you're the entrepreneur. You have agency. You may be called in a certain way to do this that is not like Alan Barnhart or anyone else, that you are called in a specific way. Great. Go do your work how you are called, but be clear about it, be intentional about it, be transparent about it. And I think all of your stakeholders will understand who you are infinitely better.
I love that answer. And yet, as from the pastoral side, I can imagine somebody saying, oh my goodness, I'm depressed. I've been running my business for 3 years. I didn't follow that advice. I didn't start off that way. And we could say to somebody, well, maybe you were non-explicitly embodying something. Were you actually thinking you live in a high unemployment area? You want to create jobs? Were you thinking, I simply want to treat people well, so well that they wonder, why are you treating people well? Maybe you want to be totally moral in all your dealings, and that's your highest goal. And maybe you want to make money to give it away. And I've heard, and others, I want to create a platform so I can share my faith. Those are the five that I hear most often when I have a conversation. You would say, yeah, those are all valid. What do you say to the person who says, okay, now I'm 45. I missed that talk. My business is 4 years old. Help me, Professor Smith.
No problem. Today's the second best day to plant a tree, right? The first best day was 30 years ago. Today's this, and I mean that in a sense, right? Like, if you're going to make that transition and it is going to be a surprise, then how you communicate that transition, why you communicate that transition is really important. So I don't think it means you can't make the change. I think it's easier at the beginning.
Yes.
It's not impossible in the middle. You just have to, again, be really intentional, really clear, really transparent about it.
That's terrific. Brett, I have covered the things I wanted to talk about, but that doesn't mean that you have said everything you want to say. So let's just imagine that somebody walks up to you and say, wait a second, aren't you Brett Smith? You're walking across the airport. Aren't you that famous faith and entrepreneurship guy? Are we going to the same gate here at the airport? Tell me, give me a nugget. Tell me something. Tell me what you haven't had a chance to say. Here I am, admiring your work as a writer.
I'll give you two quick things. So first off, I do think this is a emerging sector. I think there's tons of opportunity. I think there's lots of interesting things going on in practice. A lot of our work is just to complement that. It's not to replace that. We're trying to help the field grow and do what it does and do it better. We also do teaching. So we started a teaching conference last year. We had 185 attendees at that first conference. Surprisingly, They came from a broad range of schools. Unsurprisingly, we had small faith-based schools that you would expect to be at that conference. We also had public universities, and we had elite private schools like Duke and Princeton and Yale. And so what you're starting to see is this is actually affecting everybody. Someone says, well, I'm at a secular school. This doesn't affect my students. I said, well, probably some 70% of your students have a faith. It does affect them dramatically. And even if their faith doesn't matter or your faith doesn't matter, it doesn't mean it's not affecting them. And so if we believe that faith affects the entrepreneurial process, then we must teach about it. And if we don't, regardless of what our own faith is, we're actually giving them an incomplete understanding of entrepreneurship. And I think that's where we're at. The last thing I would add, Dan, is we've talked an awful lot about entrepreneurship and doing and identity and all the things. We've talked almost none about rest. And I do think there's a wonderful book by Jefferson Bethke called sort of To Hell with the Hustle, I think is the title of it.
Okay.
And the basic premise is like, all we hear is go, 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 eat, breathe, sleep, think about entrepreneurship all of the time. And that is inconsistent, at least with a Christian faith perspective, of rhythms of work and rest. And so I do think this is an area we're starting to see it. It's not surprising. The well-being of entrepreneurs is not good. They have higher divorce rates. They have higher suicide rates. They have higher addiction rates, mental health problems right down the line. It is in part because it is this all-in thing. This is not the only solution, but this is a partial way to address some of this, is how do we have sort of regular rhythms of work and rest? You didn't ask me about book, but if you were going to, I had one ready. Sacred Rhythms by Ruth Haley Barton is the thing that I'm reading now.
Is that a make sure you take time to rest and don't work?
This is all, it's called Arranging Our Lives for Spiritual Transformation.
All right.
And so it is all around the spiritual disciplines and how do we begin to integrate those into our lives. I think those are essential for anyone in any deep forms of work, entrepreneurs very much included.
Yeah, and deep forms of work include those forms that do not have a clock attached to them. And for what it's worth, since a lot of people who listen to this podcast are in Christian ministry, sometimes pastors are urged to work and work and work and always be accessible. And they get exhausted and they get burned out. Psalm 127 says, the Lord gives to his beloved sleep. And as I like to point out, the Hebrew is a little bit ambiguous. He gives sleep or is he gives in their sleep? Can be translated either way. But the reason why we can sleep is because he gives to us while we sleep, and he's the Lord of all things. So it is not up to us to make it succeed. The Lord can bless the work of our hands, and it can have more impact than we ever would have expected. And that's a great way to close. Thank you for that comment on the need for rest, because it means integrate your faith in your work thoroughly, including your non-work. And I believe that the time you're taking with your wife and your child or your children is part of the good life and will probably actually make you don't do it for that reason, but it'll probably make you a better entrepreneur if your life is holistic and integrated. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Brett. One more time, the University of Miami, Ohio has a Life Institute, LIFE, which stands for Leading the Integration of Faith and Entrepreneurship. I've been educated, and I hope a lot of you who listen have been educated as well. Pleasure to have you on the podcast with me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Working with Dan Doriani is a production of the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. We seek to promote faithfulness in the workplace, in education, in discipleship, and in the stories of believers who've applied their faith at work. If you want to put your faith to work and change your corner of the world, visit our website, the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. Look for faithandworkstl.org. That's one word. We'll help you start a cohort with like-minded believers who also want to practice their faith at work. This podcast is donor-supported. To keep us going, please donate on our website. Maybe more importantly, you can support us by listening, by subscribing, by sharing, by liking us, by posting us on your favorite platform, or go old school and tell a friend.